And today it is a technical Q&A with Drew MacCallum of Canon on Behind the Shot. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the live stream here at Behind the Shot. I'm Steve Brazel, your host, and I'm getting the echo from my own stream, so let me mute it, even though I told Drew to mute it. So a couple of things here. First of all, to everybody, I appreciate your joining me. This is the show where normally we try and get inside the mind of a great photographer by taking a closer look behind one of their shots, from conception to completion, all the stories and challenges that happen in between. Today's going to be a little bit of break from that. We're going to talk about all the new Canon gear. Before I dive into it, before I bring my guest in, just a reminder for everybody, a couple of things that are happening here at Behind the Shot. Make sure that you check out the critique shows that I'm doing with Don Komarechka. Those are only here on the YouTube channel. They happen usually beginning of the month, once a month. And then also, it's just been announced, Smug Mug Live, which is Smug Mug and Flickr. I'm going to be on Smug Mug Live this coming Thursday. That's at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So head on over to Smug Mug's channel, subscribe to them so that you get all the alerts with Smug Mug Live, or if you follow me on social media, I'll let you know about that as well. Also, if you want to subscribe to the podcast, if you watch this live stream and you like what you see, hopefully you do, that's the goal. Make sure that you subscribe, hit the bell so that you're alerted every time I release something new. Shows like this are usually only on YouTube, the critique show only on YouTube. But of course, the normal shows, the normal Behind the Shot episodes, are available wherever you get your podcasts in two different forms. You can subscribe to the audio only podcast feed, or you can subscribe to the video feed, whichever one fits you. And that brings us up to today. And we now have all the details on all this new Canon gear. The R5, the R6, a slew of really cool Canon lenses. I've got to admit, I never thought I would want an 800mm lens. I kind of want an 800mm lens now. And as I saw the announcements on July 9th from Canon, which they had to move to virtual, which, you know, kudos to them because they actually pulled it off. The announcements to me answered virtually all the concerns that people were raising from the rumors, right? We had all those rumors running around. We had the EOS R before this, and all the things that people were talking about, to me at least, and we'll get into that in detail, but to me, those announcements answered pretty much everybody's questions about the new gear. But I knew I needed to get somebody on from Canon to talk about it that knows a heck of a lot more about it than me. I reached out to my friend Scott Heath. He reached out to his friend Drew MacCallum. And Drew, how are you?
I'm doing great, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
It's my pleasure. You and I have met a couple of times, usually at WPPI. You wouldn't let me touch the R5 in February for some odd reason. I don't know why. Let's talk about you for just a second. You are with Canon. You are an advisor of technical information for Canon USA. Is that the best way to describe your title? Because it got sent to me and it was really long. What is your official title?
Yeah, my official title is technical advisor, technical information advisor for Canon USA. My boss calls me the chief technology evangelist. I go by lots of different titles, I filled a lot of different roles here at Canon USA, from PR to tech answers to writing white papers and things like that, to research and finding out what the next gear specs and fun stuff that photographers want to see or videographers want to see.
You actually, it looks like the live stream, no, I guess the live stream is still going. There we go. You actually do some of the white papers?
We're working on some of them. We've got a few coming out, and I'll be on actually working on some of them with a name on it. Others we co-write with others. It's a lot of work to put out a white paper. It's an extreme amount of work.
For those of you that have never seen a white paper before, it is a deep technical dive on subject A, usually, which explains a lot. When I've talked to you, the amount of information that you know about the gear, and specifically today, the gear that we're going to be talking about. Before we get into the gear, I just want to, all the people that are in the chat, I've got Connor in there, Terrell is in there, Scott Heath, our friend David Bergman, who's a Canon Explorer of Light, is in there. So to everybody that's here, thank you very much for stopping by, and let's kind of dive in here because I know you've got limited time and I want to use your time wisely. As we go through these topics, I'm going to kind of approach this from a point of view of parts of the gear. We'll talk about the sensors. We'll talk about the top panel of the bodies, etc. We'll talk about the lenses. I'll interject questions that I've gotten from people over social media as we go through. So let's first start with the R5 and the R6. The R5 is the higher body. What are we looking at price-wise for the 5 and the 6?
You know, I always have to go back to the paperwork on that because the prices are so they fluctuate everywhere, all over the place. So let's just say R5, $38.99, and
Okay.
and then R6, $24.99.
So there's there's
now.
almost $1,500 price difference between the two, and we'll kind of get into what the differences are. There's one thing I saw online I want to hit really quick, and that is on the R6. My recent episode, the current episode of Normal Behind the Shot, is with Rick Salmon, who's also a Canon Explorer of Light, because we explored him using a pre-production model of the R6 with some of the pre-production models of the RF lenses, like the 600, 800, 100 to 500. And one of the things I saw somewhere online was somebody debating whether or not the R6 was a direct replacement for the 6D. And to me, correct me where I'm wrong, I don't see the R6, even though it is a 6, it has the weather sealing and et cetera of a 6 series. I don't see it as a replacement for the 6 at all. It blows it away with autofocus features, et cetera. How do you see the positioning of these two bodies?
That's something that people always want to try and make that direct correlation between the mirrorless side and a DSLR side. What they forget is that both of those camera systems can live congruently. They live side by side, and the R6 is a 6 lineage, so it has some ideas and thoughts behind the 6 realm of who it might actually answer the question of what do I want the camera to do. Just like the R5 has a similar type thing with the 5D4 or 5D series going, what do I want the camera to do? So we have that lineage that is carried over from the DSLR side to the mirrorless side, but that doesn't mean one is a replacement there of the other. So they live side by side currently.
Which makes sense to me. And again, to me, the correlation people want to draw between the number 6 is misplaced. It's a family position. It's not a set of features or anything like that, at least to me. And
not necessarily. I mean, if you look at the specs of the R6, then yeah, there's a lot of things there that the 60 and 62 just don't have. It's like namely the frame rates and things like that. The video specifications.
Well, and again, you're talking 11 autofocus points on a 60.
Right.
Compared to what we have now, plus an EVF now, there's so much more.
Right.
Let's talk physical. My understanding in looking at these, the 5's a little bit heavier. It's like 1.6 instead of 1.5 pounds. But they're physically in your hand. You've held them both, I assume.
Of course. Yep.
Physically in your hand, about the same size?
The R5 and R6 are going to feel a little smaller just because they can be width-wise. If you think about the depth of the cameras, they are going to feel a little smaller in your hands, but at the same time, you're not going to be feeling awkward from it. They're going to feel very, very similar, but the size is going to be noticeable between a 6 and a 5, respectively. But the good news is we've put the buttons and switches and dials kind of back to where they are. We've kind of repositioned things like the AF on button and the joystick so that when you are working with these and you are coming from a 5D or 6D, that it does feel natural in your hands, so that it allows you to make that transition. Even if you are working with one of each, you've got a 5D and an R5 at a wedding or whatever, then you can very easily go back and forth between the two.
Yeah, which is kind of how I see it. Actually, Terrell made a comment in the chat that he's no longer looking for a new 7D because to him the R6, even though it's full frame, is a perfect second camera for him. And that's kind of where I see it, except when I saw the specs come out and I saw both had a Digic X processor. Should I say X or 10, by the way? You'll know.
It is Digic X.
Okay, good. I got it right. So it's a Digic X processor. But your choices on how to differentiate the bodies was interesting to me. I say your choices like, you went, no, this is what we're doing.
It was all me. No.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I find it interesting because I can see the cost savings to keep the price lower, and yet the functionality is effectively the same. So let's talk top panel. The R5 has an LCD like I'm used to on my 5D Mark IV. The 6 has a dial. Anything you want to say about those choices?
I think that's one of those personal kind of choices. I've learned to love the the dial on the R5 because it's quick and easy. And I don't find myself changing modes as much as I used to when I have the dial on top. I don't know why, but for some reason I just don't shift as much back and forth in modes.
So it's almost a personal feeling thing.
I think so. I think it's really one of those things. How much do you want it to do? The other thing is the top LCD on the R5 is fairly customizable to show you a lot of information. Sometimes when I say customizable, you can turn on and off certain settings on top. So if you just want to see the mode, it just shows you a giant M mode on top, and then you can toggle through and see other different settings that might be available. Again, it's just a matter of how you want to see that information.
I find that interesting, because that's a thing I think I have not seen that anywhere. And I think that's the type of customizable feature that some people, that'll be the deciding factor, right? I can put my own face on this camera.
Yeah, there's a lot of setups that you can do for the camera itself, as far as changing buttons and switches and dials, how they respond, how they act. We could always maybe put more customization in, but at some point you start saying, okay, well, how much customization and how do you achieve all of that customization? The requests we get are innumerable. There's just so many requests we get to, I want to customize this button, do this.
Right.
So
yeah, no, I'm with you. Let's talk rear LCD for a second.
Yep.
The R5 is a bigger rear LCD. For a lot of people, I don't know that will really matter to get 2 million dots instead of 1.6 million dots, but you've seen them both. Visually, is there a huge use difference when you're actually looking at it to you?
That comes into play sometimes maybe when you're outside and you see that the resolution can help boost that in bright sun just a little bit. But in reality, it is something that unless you put them side by side, you're not going to see a huge difference between the two. Now the EVF, and we're talking about specifications here, the EVF on the R5 at 5.6 million dots versus 5.7 versus 3.6 on the R6. To me, that is something that I can see a difference, and that is something I would be willing to pay for. That detail, that resolution is.
Is the difference that you're seeing purely because of the resolution, the 5 million dots versus the 3.x million dots, or the R5 also has a higher refresh rate capability?
Actually, they're both
It'll
the same.
do 120 hertz,
They
120
both do
frames
120
per second on the refresh.
No, they both do 120 frames. So they're really, as far as the refresh rate, you can choose the same refresh rate for both cameras. You've got a 60 and a 120. That 60 gives you, better power saving modes, or you go to the 120 if you're doing fast action. You want to, pan the camera a bit. It helps that refresh rate a lot faster. Allows you to keep that subject in a viewfinder.
We're going to get into battery in a minute, but you brought it up. I got to ask, in your experience having shot the camera, when you go to 120 frames a second versus lowering the refresh rate of the EVF, I'm going to use an example. I'm at a all-day festival. I'm shooting bands. I've got 70 bands to shoot or whatever at Warped Tour, which unfortunately is gone. Rest in peace, Warped Tour. But I'm shooting this whole thing. I'm getting low on battery. Moving that at the beginning of the day from 120 to 60. Is that going to be a pronounced difference to me in battery savings? I would think it would be noticeable. I don't know how noticeable, but
I wish I had some metrics on that, and I haven't been able to do a full day shoot on the two to try and put that real world test to try it out and see what the difference would be. But EVF is a significant drain on the battery. When you look at the battery SEPA ratings, and SEPA is an independent company that does all these measurements and things like that for us. For all companies, actually, you'll see that the measurements are done at given frame rates for given periods of time. Right. I couldn't say, it's a 10% savings going to or 20% savings going to the standard. We just don't have that data to put out there, but it would, I'm assuming, save you enough. But the question is it enough to justify the difference? Or just carry a second battery, put on the battery grip and have a second battery running with you to help compensate for that.
And then have the higher refresh rate, which gives you other advantages. I'd probably just buy another battery.
I want
to touch on something that I am confused on, and I'm guessing other people are too, and that is the weather sealing. So The marketing material seems to indicate that an R6, being a 6 series, has the weather ceiling of a 6 series, versus the R5 has the quote-unquote weather ceiling of a 5 series, versus the weather ceiling that you'd get on something like David shoots, which is the 1DX Mark III, which is the high-end pro body for those that don't shoot it. And that the 1DX Mark III is going to come back later in this conversation for something Drew and I talked about in the green room for sure. What is the difference in the weather ceiling? I mean, if I buy an R6, what am I giving up weather-wise over an R5?
You know, those are, again, there's given weather resistance ratings for separate companies out there. And unfortunately, we don't do those for cameras because there's too many variables. But yeah, the R6 is a 6D weather resistance, weather dust resistance rating. I've been out in rain showers with 6D Mark IIs. I've been out in weather, bad inclement weather with all kinds of cameras. The only thing that's really going to give you that hurricane type weather resistance is the 1D series, of course. I'm not saying go out in a hurricane. That's probably not a safe thing to do with any camera. But when you look at the R6, yeah, it's equal to the 6D too. And I like I said, we've had many people go out in pretty inclement weather with 6D2s and have not had major failures. But again, everything is dependent on how that rain's driving, how much soak time. All of those things are very, very unique to the situation.
And let's be honest, you can buy, rainstorm covers.
Always recommended.
That I would even do most likely on my high-end bodies.
Right. Yeah, and even the pros shooting Major League Sports and things like that, they're bagging their cameras if they're out at a baseball game or racetrack or whatever. They're bagging the cameras just because you never know.
Yeah. In fact, David, if you're still in the chat, David Bergman just literally as I said that chimed in on the chat. I've literally shot in hurricanes before. Not recommended.
Not recommended. No.
But here's my question, David, for you. With your 1DX, are you ever in rain where you decide, or for that matter, your 5D4, do you decide to put a rain jacket on it when you're out in a storm like that? David, answer that for me. I'm dying to know. While we're waiting on David's part of the show now. I should have just had him call in. The frames per second. I've never been, I'm going to sound stupid here, and to my viewers, I apologize. I am not a mirrorless shooter. I shoot a 5D Mark IV on one hip. I am a Canon shooter, a 5D Mark IV on one hip and a 5D Mark III on the other hip. The idea of 12 frames per second mechanical versus 20 frames per second electronic. Explain that to me, and I'm going to throw a question in at the same time. Alan Wood commented on the Rick Salmon episode that I just posted. And he said, can you customize the frame rate for the mechanical and electronic shutters if you don't need the maximum 1220? And then he also adds, we'll get into the card slots in a minute, but with the R5, do electronic shutter shots need to be written to the CF Express because of the size and the frame, 20 frames per second at 45 megapixels? How's an SD handle that? What do you say on the adjustable frames per second?
First of all, we've always had in our cameras a high continuous, high plus, what is it? High H plus, H, and then a single frame, and then a silent low frame, silent high frame. So you've got adjustable mechanical frame rates selectable. So you can go 12, 8, and 6, I think, is the three different settings between the cameras. When you go to 20 frame electronic, it's just straight 20 frame, and you see that white border around the viewfinder or LCD as you fire, and it's just blinking at you as you go 20 frames a second. I'm sure there's plenty of requests to take that down a notch to say 10 or something like that. But if you go into single frame shooting, you can just shoot with just as you shoot and get one frame in silence. So you don't have to shoot 20 all at once. You can get a single silent frame, and a lot of cameras you can't. It's just silent. Burst.
Well, and I'm used to on my 5D4 doing like a 3 or a 5 shot burst. And at 20 a second, there's no way to do that. You're going to touch the button and you've got 20 shots.
You've got 20 shots. It's going pretty, it's so fast. And, a lot of people say, well, why do you need 20 frames per second? And I'm going to refer to some of my photographers in DC, or some of my photographers that are doing press and event work where the nuance of someone's facial expression can change the story, or can really tell the story. When you have that 20 frame per second rate, that's almost video, and you can really choose that nuance of image and say, that's the one I want, that's the expression I want. Maybe it's a kid or a wedding. You've got that nuanced image, that one piece in between other pieces that you didn't have before.
I'm gonna go back to music photography, and that is when I'm shooting a singer on stage.
Yeah.
The difference, because they're moving so fast and making such weird mouth movements with a song, the difference in a millisecond can be the difference between seeing a tongue in a weird position versus seeing eyes in a great position, and it can be, just instantaneous. The slots. I want to talk about the slots a little bit, because the R5 has 2 slots. They both have 2 slots. But the R5, as can be seen in the picture here for those watching, by the way, I should say what David said. David said, as Drew says, always bag up. Why chance it? Of course, you don't want to get water on the front element, and no sealing will help that. So, good point. So the slots. I've got the picture up of the R5 slots in front of me, and it's a CF Express and it's an SD card. If you go to the R6, it's 2 SD cards. Buffers are different with these cards, with these bodies. What am I looking at as an end user to go with an R5 versus an R6 as far as really being able to use the frame rate based on the resolution and based on the limitations of, an SD card isn't a CFast card. There's no way around it. So what am I looking at as an end user on that?
Right. So the CF Express cards are a different format. They're a fairly new format. We're using 2 of those in the 1DX Mark III, and that is basically for the extreme frame rates that we're capturing, but also for the video frame rates that we're capturing. That has a lot to do with it, to why we have those frame rates as they are. When it comes to the R5, you'll be able to capture those 20 frames per second in silent shutter to the SD card if the card is fast enough. Again, it all depends on the card itself. It is a UHS 2 card slot, so it should be able to handle most anything that you go to. Of course, we have our buffer breakdown matrix of how many images to the SD cards, and that's a pretty significant list of if this then type scenarios. Are you shooting RAW plus JPEG? Right. All of that really does come into play.
What if you're shooting mirrored? What if you're shooting like I do at a concert? I'm shooting the same shots to both cards. Is that going to heavily weigh me down based on that SD compared to the CF?
Well, it's going to matter more about the type of card itself. If you put a UHS 1 card slot in that thing you're trying to shoot RAW to both, then of course you're going to be a little bit limited because it can't clear that buffer to both cards at the same time. But if you do have 2 high-speed cards in there, one CF Express and one UHS 2 SD, you're probably going to hit that. I think the buffer on that's 180 RAWs, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I've got the numbers here in front of me. The CF Express was 180.
Yep.
In the R5, the SD UHS 2 is an 87 buffer, but still, we're talking 87 images at 45 megapixels.
Still a lot, yes. Yeah,
my God,
that's still a lot of images that you're pushing through that pipeline. And again, on the R6, if you go JPEGs, you're basically unlimited because it's 20 million pixels to a really fast.
And even RAW, it's 240 RAW.
240. Yep. So you've really got a lot. If you're hammering down that long, more power to you on the editing side, because that's going to be some culling that you're going to have to do.
Well, I know David Bergman, and David, the way David shoots, he may need 1,000 buffer.
Yeah.
I'm teasing David. Yeah. Okay. So one of the biggest announcements was the long-awaited, the long-desired, the almost opined for in-body image stabilization.
My favorite thing.
See,
there.
Your face just said it right there. Even you wanted it. So in-body image stabilization, let's leave the lenses out for a second.
Yep.
In-body image stabilization on both bodies gives you how many stops?
Up to 8 stops of image stabilization.
But that's with the lenses.
Well, if
that's
you
when
consider
paired with the
a
lens, right? The bodies themselves are 5, right?
Actually, no, it's a 5-axis, meaning dimensional.
5-axis, but 8 stops.
So you can do up to 8 stops of image stabilization. Because if you look at the list we put out there, the 28 to 70 is not image stabilized. That is an 8-stop image stabilized with in-body image stabilizer lens.
Wow.
It's insane. And we're hand holding these cameras.
Have you tested it yourself?
I have, and I'm afraid to say how long we've been able to hold it because it's going to vary per user. But I can tell you that I've never handheld a camera this long without some kind of multi-shot mode in my life. It's just, Steve, you're going to go crazy for this. I'm going to challenge you, your next concert, to see how long you can hand hold and get this crazy blurred musician while the stage stands still.
Oh, I can imagine it too, right? Exactly what you said. The amps, the mic, tack sharp, but artistic. Oh, I love it. I saw you say something in a B&H stream.
Yeah.
In the B&H stream, and folks, if you don't follow B&H and if you don't watch their podcasts and their streams, you definitely should. Great people that know a lot of stuff and they know the questions to ask, right? In the B&H stream, you said something on IBIS, in-body image stabilization. You said it's up to 8 stops for stills and video.
Mm-hmm.
That's key, right? But then you said the more steady the camera, the better the in-body image stabilization, which is interesting. It used to be if you were on a tripod, you wanted to turn image stabilization off. You're saying steady the camera and it improves it?
No, I think my inference there is on how a camera can achieve focus. And this goes back to something I was told a long time ago, that the more stable that the camera is, in other words, the AF sensors, because remember, you're using a sensor on the camera to achieve focus. The more that camera can stabilize the image to identify the subject, meaning your subject's moving like this, if you're able to keep that subject still by keeping the body still, the AF sensors can lock onto the subject better. So the more stable the platform, the camera, not really the tripod, but the more stable you are, the more accurate that camera can be. Because if you're doing this all over the place, it's having a hard time because it has to move the AF point and the lens and the image stabilization. But if you've got stabilization to help shake, to mitigate the shake of you, then that camera can acquire the subject much, much easier and therefore sharper image. It still holds true if you are on tripod. I would turn off image stabilization.
Okay, good to know then. Which then comes in with the additive feature, which especially with what some of these lenses are, like when we get into the new lenses, these are inexpensive lenses that have IS. Mm-hmm. When combined with this body, it's amazing what it can do spec-wise at least. But the body image stabilization works in conjunction with lens.
With RF lenses, most RF lenses, you have what's called coordinated image stabilization, meaning the processor in the lens and the processor and gyro in the camera body are actually coordinating together where things are, what the subject distance is, the speed, all of that information, the rotation of the camera, the movement of the camera, they're coordinated together. When you go to a lens that might be an adaptive EF lens, you still have the optical stabilization of the lens itself for, depending on how the lens is built, it might have pitch and yaw, but the sensor is running pitch, yaw, and roll. So those different directions that are happening, it's able to stabilize, but they're not coordinated effort together. They're still working, but they're not coordinated specifically together like they are with an RF lens.
Okay. Andre Adet asked on Twitter, and I think this kind of touches on this because first his question. I have a question about in-camera IS. Does the IS on a lens need to be turned off for it to work, or can both be used simultaneously for more stops? So we've established that with an R body and RF lenses, they can speak to each other and work in tandem. Mm-hmm. But in the scenario that you just mentioned, and that's let's use an example of I put an EF 70 to 200 on an R5 body. The EF lens has 4 stops of IS in it.
Right.
The body has 5 axis up to 8 stops, but they aren't talking to each other.
Correct.
Can they end up fighting each other? I mean, in a top scenario, should I rely only on the in body and turn off the lens?
Well, here's the thing.
Or would you leave both on anyway?
I would leave both on anyway, because if you, on the lens itself, if you flip the IS switch to off, that turns off all image stabilization. So there's many cases.
Say that again.
If you switch off image stabilization on the lens, that turns off all stabilization. We're making it as simple as possible.
It turns it off in the body too.
Right. You don't have to go into the menu and independently control in-body stabilization and lens stabilization. There's not a separate control for all of these things. It's not a fine-tunable setup because it's so complicated in how things work, whether you're wide angle, telephoto, mid-range. There's too many variables that really you don't want to have that much control. If you flip off image stabilization on the lens, that turns off all image stabilization. So if you're working a gimbal for video and you don't want stabilization turned on, flip it on the lens and you're good to go.
Oh, okay. So that's fascinating. That's another one of those things I think people need to know. Apparently I missed something, and Christian mentioned it in the chat. The question I had asked about the differences between a electronic and mechanical shutter, and specifically in the differences for stills. Could you, again, not being a mirrorless shooter, and I apologize if I sound stupid here, what is happening with a mirrorless or a mechanical that I need to know as a user?
Well, it's a matter of how the system works. Even though it's a mirrorless system, there still is a mechanical shutter that closes or opens for the exposure. And especially when you're dealing with very fast shutter speeds, once you go to a 60th, 100th, 250th and faster, that's actually a mechanical shutter that's closing to stop the exposure. Because these aren't what are called global shutters, meaning the sensor, everything fires at one time and then turns off. It's actually a scan of the sensor from top to bottom. And if you're running a very slow sensor read off, then you're going to see, say this pen, you're going to see his pen warp, and that's called rolling shutter. So mechanical shutter allows you to shoot at very fast shutter speeds and turn that exposure off very fast, especially 500th of a second. You can't turn on and off the sensor that fast all at the same time. They're not global. So that's the one reason to have a mechanical shutter in the camera. Also for flash sync. If you notice in silent shutter, you don't have a flash sync speed at all, because basically you can't run all of your pixels on the sensor in synchronization with the flash itself, because it is that scan of the sensor, right?
Right.
So that's the reason that we have mechanical and electronics, is that silent shutter allows you to be just basically noise-free when you're in your situations like press events and whatever, weddings where you don't want to be heard.
Television sets where they used to have to use a blimp.
Blimps, yep, movie sets, television sets. You probably don't have to worry about that too much in concert. However, you start shooting music videos, you need to have that quiet thing, because you just don't want anything to potentially be picked up by a microphone.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, that all makes sense. Hopefully that made it a little clearer for you. Batteries. As I touch on batteries, I'm going to mess up the name. Ramaj 7070 in the chat said, would love to know if the R5, R6 can actually be powered via USB using a supported power bank, which is handy. Like, I'm using my webcam right here as a 5D Mark IV. I don't trust a battery, so I got an AC kit for it. Can you power these off of USB?
That's a really tough question for you there, Ramaj 770. The Canon official answer is the PDE-1 power adapter is the only one that will do that, simply because there's too many variables on the PD power supplies, and I wouldn't want you to go out there and plug in a power supply and it ruin your camera because it's not the right voltage or it's not the right kind of PD power supply. I'd be cautious on it, not to say that it wouldn't work, but I can only say the PDE-1 would do it.
Right. Okay. Battery then.
Yep.
Since you can't power it over USB, we're going to have a battery most likely. The battery ratings of, for example, 220 shots.
Yeah.
So now I understand that's a standards based test, right? That's not real world. And we'll find out when these things hit the market.
Yeah.
But I can take my 5D Mark IV to a festival, shoot all day with the thing, come home with 1,500, 2,000 shots, and have not changed a battery.
Right.
I mean, maybe at the end I get nervous and I'll change it, because Foo Fighters are about to hit the stage. I'm like, I've got one square left. Just change it, Steve. Just change it.
Power up.
Yeah, exactly. So explain to me, because 220 to me, I'm going to be honest, it looked really low.
It does. And that is one of those things when the SEPA ratings came out with the EOS R back in 2018, it was very similar in that 200, 300 on the power rating from SEPA. But the first day we had all the press and media out shooting with it, they came back to us and said, well, I just got 2,000 images on this. How come I got 2,000, not 300? That's because the SEPA ratings are typically very, very conservative. Realistically, again, it depends on how much are you going into the menu and playing with it and playback and zoom and what all are you doing with the camera. So there's a lot of variables for power supply. Realistically, Steve, you're probably going to see, I'm going to bet 800 to 1,000 images just on,
which is fine.
Just kind of my experience. I'm not talking about what the spec says, just how we typically work.
So connectivity, since we mentioned the USB-C, let's jump into connectivity. It does have, both these bodies have USB-C.
Yes.
I'm assuming that's for file transfer to a computer.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you want to do tethered operation, you can do tethered operation and things like that. Downloads.
But then you got micro HDMI, and I it's not mini, and
it's micro.
I'm using a mini HDMI connector for this camera right now. Any idea, was it purely a space savings to your knowledge? You may not know why they went micro.
It's space. It's basically, we pack so much. If you ever take these cameras apart and peel back all the layers of what's happening inside.
No, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure someone's going to. Don't do it. You will see how little space there is inside these camera bodies, and wherever we can find ways to save space and improve. When it comes to the engineering side, if they can improve anything inside engineering wise, they will. They're not going to sacrifice something to say, okay, we're just going to use a HDMI mini or micro because that's what we randomly chose. It's mainly for size.
Okay, which, yeah, I totally get that. Wi-Fi, though, made me happy. You've got Wi-Fi in both.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the R5 has an advantage there, and you've got Bluetooth in both.
Right.
And the R5 has an advantage there. Tell me first about the Wi-Fi. Obviously, 5 gigahertz on the R5, right?
Right. So you do have that different bandwidth, so it gets you above all the interference of 5 gigahertz. Most of your laptops and everything today is running a 5 gigahertz band. Your mobile devices are running a 5 gigahertz band. Allows for very fast transfer, and even today with Canon Camera Connect, you can toggle an option on so that it will automatically transfer from the camera to your mobile device. Now you can imagine if you're transferring every raw file that you're shooting to your iPhone, might fill up your phone pretty quick. But it is there if you want to do it. You can send every image you shoot to the mobile device.
Bluetooth.
Bluetooth is it's very misunderstood in the camera world. What we do at Canon is the Bluetooth technology stays on between the camera and the mobile device, and it keeps that link together. So you don't have to reconnect every time through your mobile device settings for connect to Wi-Fi. Basically, you send an image.
Okay.
If you basically say send, it reestablishes the Wi-Fi connection based on that Bluetooth. It's a link, it's a handshake, so that they really stay connected full time.
But the file transfer is still over Wi-Fi.
The file transfer is always over Wi-Fi, yes.
Okay. So then the R6 has Bluetooth 4.1, whereas the R5 has Bluetooth 5. I'm not a Bluetooth engineer, but my understanding would be, 5 is much lower energy use, so that's probably some battery savings there. Correct?
Yep. Mainly it's just, but your functionality is not going to be that much different compared to, say, if you're shooting to your iPhone or your Android device. You're not going to see huge differences between those two.
Okay. So now let's touch on the meat of the matter, which is the sensors. The R5 is 45 megapixels. The people who have waited for this, thank you. But I wanted to kind of go through from the outside in, you know what I mean? R5 is 45 megapixels with a maximum shot size of 8192 by 5464. The R6, 20.1 megapixels, 5472 by 3648.
Yep.
So before I get into, the internet complaining about a camera that they don't even have in their hands yet, which we'll get into. We talked about this in the green room. Let's be clear here. The 20.1 meg, they're both full frame standard 35 millimeter sensors.
Yes.
So the R6 at 20.1 has much larger pixels, much larger. The stat that I saw said, and I quote, similar to a 1DX Mark III. And then I've heard other people say it's the same sensor as a 1DX Mark III. Is it the exact same 1DX Mark III sensor?
Not the exact same. It's based on the 1DX3 sensor. And the reason is every camera needs to be tuned for its purpose. And you look at the 1DX purposes and what it does and all of the other things that are part of the 1DX, such as the low pass filters and all that, because it is different. We call that out specifically in the 1DX3. It has a very unique low pass filter on that. It is slightly different on the R6. So that's when we talk about the sensor, it's not the exact same, but it is very, very, very similar.
Okay, but being larger pixels, larger photo sites at 20.1 megapixels, I'm guessing is also the explanation for the ISO difference.
Correct.
Because the ISO on the R6, literally, especially in expanded mode, is double. It goes twice as high.
Right.
That's why, right?
That's why. That's absolutely why. You've got larger pixel sites that better light gathering capabilities for that higher ISO or long exposure type capability. Then yeah, it does have that advantage, and that's always been the case in pretty much every camera we've put out there. The 6D2 is fabulous for low light work and high ISO performance.
Right. So Terrell, who's in the chat today, in fact, he's really active in the chat. And Terrell, thanks for stopping by. Regular watcher of the show and a super nice guy. He asked a question on Twitter. You know how a lot of camera bodies and Canon cameras have done this before too, where you have different size crop options that you can do. So you've got a 30 megapixel image, but you can shoot at a smaller raw size, right? His question is there a crop down mode or a mode where I can shoot 26 megapixels as an example, or 24 or whatever, if he doesn't want full res on an R5?
Right. You've got a 1.6 crop option in the R5. So it is a very easy selectable crop mode. So you can crop down on that. My question is always that why not capture as much as you can at the time and then crop down later on, or you have a little bit more flexibility in your crop later on. That again, that's a personal thing, and I totally understand that. But yeah, we do give you that 1.6 crop built in.
Well, any idea without me doing the math in my head what that comes out to? Instead of 45?
I think it comes down
Somebody
to...
will put it in the chat, I'm sure.
Yeah, I forget the exact spec on that. I can actually
somebody do a 1.6 on 45 and see what we get. So, see, I could see a situation where your card's running out, you don't have another card, and you go, I want to save some space here, and I want to shoot at a lower res, and that would be handy for that. But now from the internet complaint department, again, and no one even has the camera in their hands yet. I love this. David Bergman shoots a 1DX Mark III. David Bergman is literally one of my heroes in photography. I have never heard him or anybody else that uses a 1DX Mark III, for that matter, I've never heard anybody complain that a 1DX Mark III has 20.1 megapixels. You can make perfectly good, sellable, professional images on 20.1. And yes, contrary to belief, you can actually crop them and still print 16-inch prints if you want. For most people, I've got a printer back here, the Canon Pro 1000, but for most people that are only sharing these things, thank you, Scott Heath, he said it's 72. Which
17. We're about 17 megapixels.
So it's about 17 megapixels. Okay.
Yep.
The difference. Or 27. That would be 27. I'm sorry.
I'm actually looking at the tech note right now. It actually says 17.3.
Okay, good. So the math is a skill.
Not
So
a map guy.
17.3.
Yep.
And Brant got it. Thank you, Brant. So here's the deal. Most people are not printing anyway. I wish more people would. I believe that having a hard print in your hand is an amazing thing.
Mm-hmm.
But most people are posting maybe 2,000, 2048 pixels. I often post 1,000 pixels online. You can take a 20 megapixel image, you can crop it to death and still have plenty for what most people are using it for. And even a wedding photographer could crop it and sell a 16-inch print with no problem. So I'm hearing all over the place, oh, if only the R6 had 24 megapixels. It's a 4 megapixel difference. Or if only it had a 30. Okay, well, in that case, just go a 30 to a 45 isn't a big enough difference in a product line for any business.
Right.
So, and again, David's in here, and David just said, I've never had a client say they need more pixels.
Right.
Exactly. So with that in mind, what is your answer to people that are saying, because a lot of it's not complaint, it's a mental issue. Like me, I've got 30 on my 5D Mark IV, and there's this mental thing of, well, I do crop my images. What's it going to be like if I drop to 20, right? It's all mental to me. The 20 is totally usable. What is your answer to people that are concerned about moving down in pixel count?
Yeah, and that's
buy the
really,
R5 and be done with it?
No, I wouldn't say that, because with that 45 million pixels comes a slew of different things that you have to consider. Is storage, both in camera and when you get home. You know, are you really wanting to edit that much in space, and how much is that going to add to your you know, I've got a 20 terabyte server over here, but when you look at the R6 and 20 million pixels compared to 24 of maybe some competitors or some of the other ones out there, you're looking at such a small percentage in difference. I'm not sure if you put them side by side visually, are you going to see a difference in 4 or 5 million pixels? I forget what the actual percentage is. It's just like, you know, 3% difference in size.
I don't think you will.
It's a lot of it has to do with good quality pixels, not necessarily the quantity of the pixels, and how good is that file coming off the sensor? How malleable is that sensor? How much can you push that sensor? What's the heat buildup if you do crank up those ISOs? All of that is behind the scenes. I know it's beyond that 20 versus 45, but there you have to really choose on what is it that you want the camera to do, so that you can decide what is it that you want the camera's features to be. If you're a landscape nature shooter and you want detail in the trees at a half mile away, you're probably going to want the R5.
Well, like you shot a yacht picture that you posted online that was from far away. You shot with a 100 to 500. And what I tell people is, and David just mentioned this in the chat, everybody thinks you always print at 300 PPI.
No.
Right? And or DPI, depending on if it's on screen or print, right? And you don't. So if you're printing a large print, you're not printing at that, because like if you go into I always use clothing stores as an example, where they have these prints of models on the wall that fill the whole wall. If you walk up 3 feet from it, you'll see the pixels. They're half an inch apart. Right? It's designed to be seen from farther away. So the bigger you print on this camera natively at 200 PPI, you could get an 18 by 27 print. How many of you are printing 18 by 27? And you go lower than that if you need to, if it's going to be really big. Not a problem. What I said online was, you know what? Some cameras just may not be for you, and that's okay. Buy the camera that fits your workflow and enjoy your day. That's really what it comes down to me.
And I get that the cropping factor is part of it. You mean there's very few images I go out there and I don't crop something, some way, somehow. It's never exactly the same in the camera than what you envisioned it to be. So I'm going to crop a little bit along the way. So a lot of people will have that argument of cropping power of 20 million pixels. And again, that does go back to the quality of those pictures, how much power behind those, how much detail have you captured through the lens for the image to be sharp enough to handle that crop as well. There's a lot of play, again, in all of that together. So
I want to move on from this topic, but there's two things that I got to say in here, and that is, David just said in the chat, it's the right tool for the job, right? If he's doing sports or concerts, 20 megapixels all the way, high ISO, better high ISO frames per second, And a commercial job, you may go for the R5. But Reno said, can Drew explain the difference in resolution from an EF mount versus an RF mount? So if I use an EF lens on this, am I losing anything?
No, you're really not. I mean, if you take
I get the benefits of the mirrorless as far as the edge of the frame and stuff, even if I'm using EF.
Yeah, if you look at things like, well, I'll just use a very simple example of the 35 f2 RF versus the 35 1.8 EF mount. Those two lenses are almost identical, but internally reversed. Of course, one has image stabilization and half macro capability in the RF mount, but the edges on that 35 were able to push the sharpness level on the edges to that. But when it comes to resolving power, EF doesn't have that, quote, limitation, complete total limitation that we do now. Again, it's just how we can build the lens.
But can an EF lens, properly resolve 45 megapixels?
Absolutely.
Because a lot of them weren't, that glass wasn't designed for that.
Not sure who says that, because we've been pushing 50 million pixels for several years.
There you go. Okay. So, because that was one of the questions in there Morris Meyer asked. And a bunch of other people, Mike Martin on Facebook, Jeff Harmon, they all asked about this 20 megapixel thing. So let's move on to ISO, because ISO is a big one to me. The R5 is up to 51,000. I don't know anybody that's going to shoot it. Expandable to 102. The R6 goes up to 102 natively, 102,400. Expandable to 204,800. Again, don't know anybody's going to shoot it, except they just need to do it because you got to test it, right? But here's my question, because I want the R5 myself for concerts, and I kind of want both, in all honesty. But how usable is the R5 at higher ISO compared to like my 5D4? Like my 5D4 starts to deteriorate at 3200. I shoot 64 regularly. They're noisy. The R5, just by sheer design, even though it's not as good as the R6 and it's 45 megapixels packed in, how's its low light performance compared to the 6?
Well, I think you're going to find that if you're shooting an R5 for your concert work, you're going to be pleasantly surprised in how much more you can push that sensor, because even with the EOS R, I was able to push that a little bit further and shoot at much higher ISOs, because again, the Digic processor has a lot to do with that, and running the Digic X processor that we have now, that will actually change a lot of how people will work. And I think I told you at the last WPPI, I was shooting concert stuff at 20,000 ISO, and you were like, "No, really?" And it's there. If you shoot it correctly, you can actually get publishable, usable images.
That was on the 5?
On the EOS R, and now going to the
on the
R5,
regular R.
R, going to the And again, it's all dependent on your level of acceptance for what is acceptable. Now, I always send it to the editor, and they go, "Yep, I'll take it, no problem." Now, would I print a billboard with it? Probably not.
All right. Well, and the R5 has the better low pass filter. We talked about low pass filter earlier. So that's a key there. The autofocus system, though, is identical in both, correct?
They are. Yep. Yeah, you do have the same dual pixel CMOS AF2.
Which is unlike mine, which was only available in live view. It's available because now you're using an EVF, so you get the dual pixel autofocus through the viewfinder.
Well, you get that, but it's also using the deep learning technology that we've imported over from the 1DX Mark III, and that's part of the subject tracking and recognition system, where it's really able to identify the subject's face, head, body, eyes, and to really move quick. Dogs, cats, birds. It's been such a weird experience to go out and photograph ospreys and have it go behind a tree, and it still tracks the bird, and it doesn't care if the trees are closer and more detailed definition. It's locked onto that osprey as it goes through, and on the other side of the tree, it's still on the bird.
So Hero Shots just said, does the R5 or R6 have an AA filter? I don't know what.
Yeah, everything we've done, even the 5DS and SR, they had low pass filters. They were just different designs of a low pass filter.
Okay.
So yes, they do.
Well, and the 5 here has the high res OLPF low pass filter.
Right.
So there is a slight sensitivity difference. The R6 goes down to minus 6.5 versus minus 6, but they both go up to plus 20, which is great.
Right.
I hear often, oh, it's got great focus, or oh, it's got low light. I rarely hear people talk about it's got great focus in low light. Your experience?
Well, this is one of the things that we actually demonstrated to our people in the field rep team, where we actually turned off all the lights in the studio in our office here in Melville, turned on an iPad, and the cameras were able to focus using just the light from the iPad to illuminate the entire scene. So the cameras can see in low light and follow that subject. Now, the question is, what lens do you have attached to it? Because that's going to have a lot of question. If it's an f4 lens, it's not going to see the same way as it is if the 1.2 lens. So all of those measurements at, EV65 is at 1.2 at the center AF area. So
which brings up a question John Balboni asked on Twitter, and that is, with the new lenses being f11, specifically the 600 and the 800, in low light with those f11 lenses, fixed f11, do you think that there'll be a hunting issue in low light?
Depends on how low light you want to discuss. They do, when you mount those two lenses to the R5 and R6, you'll see the focus area drop down to a 60 by 80 area. So it's just the center box area for selective focus. We went out and shot some stuff early morning, and it's not, any lens is going to struggle if you have lower light, right? So if you have an f11 lens, it's not going to be able to see as well as an f4 lens or f2.8 lens. So you're going to see some differences, but I haven't done a whole lot at night with the new f11 lenses. We just introduced them, so we haven't had a whole lot of time to play with them yet. I think you're going to be surprised by these f11 lenses more than you think. I'll tell you,
with Rick being on the show, the shots he gave me were literally nothing short of stunning. Specifically, the cardinal shot that he shot with the 100 to 500 was like, oh my God. So I'm so glad that somebody asked this. It was in the Photo Taco listeners Facebook group, which is a podcast, Photo Taco podcast. Great podcast, by the way, by Jeff Harmon. David Todd asked the question Steve wants to know, because I've talked with this with a bunch of people. It's no secret. My one complaint with my 5D4 is that spot metering doesn't follow the focus point. And a lot of people don't know this and will say, oh, use spot metering. And I explained to them, in a concert scenario, you could move your focus point up and to the right on a brightly lit, spotlit singer's face, and it could still be metering off black stage if you are in spot meter mode on a 5D4. Only the 1DX series does the spot meter follow the focus point. So my question is, on these bodies, do you have any idea if the spot meter follows the focus point? Please say yes. Please say yes.
That's a really good question. Technically, it is the center area. However, if you are tying the exposure situation, the evaluative system actually applies more metering to where you're focused. So that's a good one to look into more. I'd have to determine if it's truly tied to the AF point. Okay. And while we're doing that, I will look and see if
it may not, with your system, with the new system, it may not matter, but then that brings in the other question are the focus points horizontal, vertical, cross type, dual cross type?
Well, they're none of which. They're dual pixel CMOS AF. So they're not the same type of autofocus system.
The whole old concept is gone then.
It's somewhat gone. I mean, they're based on the pixel itself. Simply because when you look at how a DSLR autofocus system is, it's a separate array of sensors for focus, and they're either running in horizontal orientation, vertical orientation, or a diagonal orientation underneath the submirror of the camera. So when you're looking at the R5 and R6 now, you're running dual pixel CMOS AF, which is pixel for pixel. Each one is the focus system. So it is a little bit different. And when I'm looking at the spot metering description here, it's only 3% of the screen. So it is tied to the center area. It is not tied to given AF points.
The point where it moves. But again, it may be a moot point based on the new system.
Right. And as because you're starting to weight the exposure to that, you're able to tie a little bit more to it. But when you do put it in spot metering, it is that center 3%.
Okay. So let's finish up the bodies and then touch on the lenses really quick. The bodies, sure. The main thing we got to cover still is the video. R5 does 8K, R6 does not. That's one big difference. Mm-hmm. There's no crop, by the way. There was on the R5, there's a slight crop. It's minimal, 1.07.
1.07. It's because the aspect ratio of UHD, UHD video versus DCI, 17:9 versus 16:9 inside a 2:3 frame.
Okay. And the R6 doesn't have DCI. It's UHD only.
It's UHD only.
The R5 does DCI. There's also a compression difference, right? They have different compression algorithms, so it's only IPB.
Correct. On the R6, it's only IPB. And you get all I or IPB. You've got all the different choices. IPB, all I. In 8K, you've got RAW. So you've got a lot of different choices on R5, depending on your video needs. How much editing do you do? If you're going to, shoot a lot of shoot straight to YouTube or a video news outlet, you might be fine with the R6 because you're going to capture that video, trim it, do some light color grading, and send it. You're not going to do frame by frame edits.
Right. But if you're going to try matching a C500 or a C200 raw footage, you might want the R5 where you've got all those capabilities.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
R5 also has different frame rates, obviously. So it's all the stuff you would think difference-wise.
Right.
The one thing that came out, and Canon released a media alert on this.
Mm-hmm.
The media alert was called Details Regarding Canon EOS R5, EOS R6 Overheating During Video Recording. This became a thing online where people were saying, I've heard that it overheats, I've heard that it overheats. Before I let Drew answer this, let me just say, I was shooting an outdoor festival in 110-degree weather, and my DSLR overheated, right? It's electronics, people. If it's in the sun, it's going to overheat. If it's in the sun and you're capturing 8K video, which, let's be honest, you can't even deliver it as 8K. You're doing that so that you can crop in, right? Because there's no delivery mechanism for 8K really right now. Then yes, there is a possibility that your gear may overheat. That's called physics. So with that in mind, I don't need to defend Canon. I'll let you speak to this. It just, sometimes I see these things and it's like, oh, well, I heard. Again, it's okay that a camera is not right for your use case. If you need a cinema camera, go buy a cinema camera. But if you've got cinema cameras and you want a second small body to attach to the roof of a car that doesn't cost as much in case the car crashes, right?
Or when it does.
And you're shooting, or when it does, intentionally perhaps.
Intentionally. And
you're shooting a 10-minute, racetrack scene. This may be the perfect body for you. So what is your answer to this quote unquote argument? Because Canon's been super transparent here.
We have been. We've tried to be as forthcoming as possible and say, you know what, the 8K record time is 20 minutes. And that's just limitations of how you can drive, sensor, processor. It's 8K footage running at 2,600 megabits a second. It's huge data rates.
Yeah.
And it's there for a reason. So we said, you know what, we'll give you as much as possible. There's going to be a drawback, and that drawback is heat. You're going to run it full width, 4K, 120 frames a second. There's a potential for some heat on that. And running, I think we limit that to 7 minutes. I can't think of too much time where I'm recording beyond 2 or 3 minutes of slow motion footage in a take. Usually it's pretty fast action. All right, shoot it and then cut. All right, let's do another one. Do another take. 4K 120. Let's do another take. So you might do several takes that are very short clips. If you run 7 minutes of 120 frame video, that's a long take.
Yeah,
the hard
that's
part
a lot of data.
It's a lot of data. And the hard part was when you really drive these cameras, what's the cooldown period? And that was the big question, is how do you go back to that 20 minutes of record time? And what is that limitation? That's where we put out that media alert, so that it's not that we're having to cover anything or restate. It was basically a restatement saying, here's the real information for you. For those of you that are trying to make a decision on what this does, if it does overheat, you're gonna have to wait 10 minutes to get 3 minutes of record time. You make 20 minutes, you get 8 minutes of record time. I think that's the math. So we try and put that out there just so you have that knowledge. These cameras don't have a fan in them because, again, this is a multi-purpose camera. It's meant for stills and video. If you look at the cinema bodies, they're dedicated video. They've got fans in them. They're built for this type of work.
Yeah, that's a great point. This is a hybrid body.
It's a hybrid.
And you're complaining it doesn't shoot 8K footage for 4 hours. I mean, it just, people, come on.
I understand the need and I understand the question. And you know what? We take all of that and go, all right, how do we handle that in future units? How do we take this? What are you doing with 8K? Show us what you're doing so we can take that knowledge and go, aha, here's what we can do next time. But for now, I think we've produced amount of information that's out there for people to make a wise decision on what they're doing. Again, most people aren't delivering in 4K to begin with, but even at 4K, 24 and 30, there's no record limit other than the 29.97 that's imposed in the camera itself. But that's a long time.
I think for most people that would buy this, like somebody said, you know, Terrell said, the guy who's bummed that he can't get 29 minutes of 4K at 120 isn't Tarantino. Look, those people exist that need that. I get it. I totally get it. And there are cameras for that from Canon.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to defend Canon here. This is just one of those that was a big thing to me that, I don't know. So let's close out with lenses. This will be a short part and I'll let you get on with your day here.
No worries.
Two big super zooms. The 600 millimeter RF and the 800 millimeter RF. They're both fixed at f11. They're both diffracted optics, which was an interesting thing to me.
Huh?
And they're collapsible. So explain these things to me.
Well, the demand is there for long telephoto zooms that people can get into at we'll call it an entry-level price point. I mean, before you didn't have an 800 millimeter or 600 millimeter lens that was lightweight and affordable. And when you pick these two up, I mean, and I think Rick Salmon said the best, if he could juggle, he would juggle with these lenses. I can juggle. I won't juggle with the lenses, but I could. They are so light. It's something you don't really understand until you pick one up. And to go out and photograph, you know, egrets and birds and airplanes at the local air show when we get back to normalcy and they have air shows, I think you're going to have an absolute blast with these lenses for those situations, because I don't know about you, but swinging around an 800 millimeter lens all day, it gets a little backbreaking. And sometimes I want to cheat and I might carry these out with me just to see, you know, how long can you go? You're going to go a long day with this. These are so light.
I could use these at shows, except for the f11 for me is going to be tough. But again, that's dependent on the fact that these new bodies have higher ISO performance or better ISO performance than my 5D Mark IV will. So it may be amazing what I actually can do. A soundboard shoot at a day festival, these could be actually really interesting, and they're IS.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you go
so you got 5 stops in the 600 and 4 in the 800.
If you go to a college sporting event, many of those stadiums are 80% daylight, and you're going to have pretty good capabilities with. Not that the pros in the dugouts or the sidelines are going to be shooting with f11 lenses, but maybe you're a stringer for a newspaper, or maybe you're mom and dad, and you've got Johnny playing on a big time game or Sally playing a big time game. You're going to have the ability to get those images that you couldn't get before. You'd have to rent a lens. Maybe in this case, you could buy the lens for what the rental might be.
Yeah. Okay. Cost. Because this is to me, when I saw the cost, I actually thought, I'm not even kidding, I thought it was a typo. I thought there was supposed to be a 1 in front of each of these.
No, that's the thing. So if you look at them, I always have to cheat on prices, so I always apologize. $699 for the 600 and $899 for the 800. You know, they're sub $1,000 to get into a long zoom lens like this that you can put into your bag. That, you know, you're going down to the Everglades for a weekend, or you're going on a cruise for a trip up to Alaska and you want to photograph the eagles. Holy cow, that'd be a lot of fun to not have to worry about swinging around a big hourglass and Now you can store it in your bag. They literally collapse into your bag with no problem.
Yeah, the way they collapse, and I had put a scene up of the there it is right there, the 600 expanded versus the 800 collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating to me. Their IS, it ties in, I'm guessing, their RF lenses. They talk to the body, so you probably get 6 to 8 stops of IS
these are
with
the
bodies?
two that aren't dedicated coordinated image stabilization. We do have that disclaimer out there, but they are extremely well stabilized for 600 and 800 millimeter lenses. You're going to have some really good results with these two pieces. They're shockingly sharp.
And then you've got the 100 to 500, which is an f4.5 to 7.1. It's $2,700.
Yeah.
This is an interesting one because this one is also telescoping.
Yeah.
Right? So the focus is it the focus or the zoom?
The focus is internal, but the zoom is external. Most of our lenses that are zoom lenses are external zooming. I always hear that thing is, why isn't this internal zooming? Well, the only internal zooming I think are the 28-70 and 70-200. The others are external zooming, so it's not a big deal. It's not a weather resistance issue at all. The 100 to 400 EF is an external telescoping zoom lens, and it's weather sealed the same as any other L series lens. This lens, the RF 100 to 500, I think is going to be that go-to wildlife, sports, nature. I mean, I love carrying a 16 to 35 or now the 15 to 35 RF and now the 100 to 500. That's my travel kit. I skip the middle range and go right from the wide to the long.
One of my favorite lenses is the EF 16 to 35, the newest one, the Mark III, I guess it is. It's just so amazing. So there's also extenders, RF extenders, a 1.4 and a 2.0, as you would expect any extenders. They are comparatively, I thought, expensive for extenders, but you've got them. And then you've got the new macro, which is an f2.85 macro. One thing, first of all, it's IS.
Yeah.
But this is not a 1-to-1 ratio true macro, right?
Correct. It's a half life size, very similar to our 35 RF design, where it's a half life size macro. And 35 at half life size macro is, to me, a little bit wide for a close-up macro, but it's a great portrait lens if you want to get up a little closer to a subject, but still have that wider width. The 85 f2 RF, being a half life size macro, makes an incredible portrait lens because you're able to get even closer to your subject. Think about it. It's a foot, 1.15 inches, 1 foot, 15 inches. So you get really close to your subject and its half life size can blow out that background really, really nice, even though it's f2. People say, well, I wanted a 1.2 or I wanted a 1.8. At f2, being a macro lens, half macro, it does change that look. It's a beautiful, beautiful lens. And it's in that price point, I think $599 for that lens. So it's really accessible for a lot of people.
I have the price on that? I didn't write the price down.
Pretty sure that was $599.
That's inexpensive. That's a nice lens for that price.
It's going to be that go-to. I mean, we've had the 85 1.8 since, when was that? 1994, I think, was when that lens almost. It's been around a while, and it has never been refreshed. I had much longer hair, but it's never been refreshed. And so this is going to take that same spot and be a beautiful go-to portrait lens, especially on a EOS R6. Holy cow, that'll be a fun combination.
And my favorite portrait lens is still my 100 2.8 macro. It's just such a soft bokeh behind it. So our last question, this is from Dave Simpson via Facebook. And this is something I think a lot of people wonder about. Like even me, I take my gear out. It's a 5D4. It's a 70 to 200L. Mark II, they're weather sealed lenses, but you always wonder in the back of your head, we talked about it earlier, throw a sleeve on if you're worried about it. But he said, I'd be keen to understand a bit more about weather resistance with the RF extended lenses. And I'm guessing he's talking about the 600 and 800 that collapse and then extend. Can we let rain drop on the barrel fully extended and then contract it back without drying it first?
Well, because
these are not weather sealed lenses.
We do not state any weather resistance on the 600 and 800 millimeter lenses. I would, in any case, I would dry off the lens before I retracted anything, whether it's any lens, whether it's the 100 to 500. I mean, I would try and protect anything, because again, water, if you ever had a leak in your house, you realize that that water will find its way to the weirdest spot, no matter how many things you put in its way. So I would try and dry things off as much as possible, as quick as possible, regardless of weather resistance of the lenses and bodies themselves.
So,
I'm not sure
Drew,
that answers the question.
I've taken so much of your time. That answered it perfectly. I so appreciate your time very, very much. By the way, for those that tuned in late, Drew is an advisor of technical information for Canon USA. And I got to thank everybody at Canon that made this happen. Scott Heath, our mutual friend, for getting this together as well. Thank you so much. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about the bodies or lenses that you wanted to tell people about?
Oh, wow. We covered a lot of ground, and I think as consumers start to get these things in their hands, they're going to realize how powerful these two cameras are and how much work we've put into these two cameras and lenses. The R system is still, I consider it a toddler. It's not really infancy. I think that was maybe 2 years ago. Maybe it's now a toddler and it's starting to walk a little bit and talk a little bit. So I think you're going to realize how much power there is behind the sensor and processor, and what we can do and how innovative we can be. So I thank you for having me on and giving me this opportunity.
Dude, first of all, it's really good to see you again, right? I've met you a number of times, and it's good to see you again. Beyond anything, I hope you, your family, and those that are important to you are well and safe during these weird times. But I really appreciate your time doing this. I appreciate Canon taking the time to do this. And just correct me if I'm wrong here, usa.canon.com.
Correct.
For the website. And all social media. And by the way, I don't know that they'll see this, but the people who run socials for Canon have reshared this and reshared my Rick Salmon episode. Thank you so very, very much. Let me just say that right now. It's Canon, at Canon USA on all socials, correct?
Mm-hmm. I believe, yes.
Okay, perfect. So to everybody that tuned in, we've got 85 people still in the chat right now. So to all of you guys that came in, to David, to Terrell, Scott Heath, Connor, Lou. Oh, Lou's in there too. Kevin, Christian. I could go on and on. Yeah, Lou's in there too. Thank you so much for watching this. I really appreciate it. This is Behind the Shot. I'm the host, Steve Brazel. The show normally, for those of you that enjoyed this, please subscribe, click the bell on YouTube. Shows like this are only on YouTube, as well as the critique shows that I do with Don Komarechka once a month, image critique shows. We do that through our Flickr group. And the normal podcast, we take one shot from a photographer and we dissect it. We talk to that photographer and try and understand why they made the choices that they did. Basically, the way I describe it is we try and get inside the mind of great photographers by taking a closer look behind one of their shots. That podcast is at behindtheshot.tv. You can subscribe to it in either audio or video formats, wherever you get your podcasts. And again, you can also go to the website. The videos are also posted here. Quick reminder as well, Smug Mug Live, right here on YouTube with Alistair Jolly. I'm actually recording a Behind the Shot episode with him in 40 minutes. But I'm going to be on Smug Mug Live this coming Thursday, July 23rd, 10 a.m. Pacific time, talking about concert photography. YouTube.com/smugmugfilms is the URL. So put it in your calendar. Make sure to join me there. To everybody at Canon, to Drew MacCallum, thank you so much for joining me on Behind the Shot. We will see you on the next show.